Tonight, we have a really special guest. I thought a really nice way to wrap up this year would be to share probably what I think you could argue is the original human craft. I think the blacksmiths like to say they're the first craft, and the basket makers like to say that they were the first craft, but I think that storytelling might predate them all. And the tradition of gathering around, especially in this season when the days are short and the nights are long, to share stories and to share memories and human experience has such a long history in who we are and is kind of wired into our very DNA. So I'm so glad that Terry O'Brien, a Northern storyteller who has been connected to North House in many ways for decades, almost since the very beginning, is able to be with us tonight to share some stories. She's gathered a great collection and entitled them North of Nowhere. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Terry. I'm going to start out by sharing some photos she wanted me to share. There's our first photo, and Terry's going to tell you more about where these are from. And the second photo.
And those are from our house. There we go. All right. Okay, there we go. So you've come to the Swami Hills of northern Minnesota. Swami is a 100-plus-year-old community founded by immigrants from Finland. And our little house that you saw as you came across the hills was built in 1945 by Carl Salo. Stories tonight, let's make ourselves comfortable, come from what I call North of Nowhere, from northern cultures from around the Arctic Circle and some, like us, further south. But North of Nowhere can also be an emotional state, a place that when you're feeling down or blue or out of touch, disconnected, far distant from family and friends, North of Nowhere is that place too. So I say, let story bring us together. This first story comes from Ukraine, and you, if you are a young kiddo, might be familiar with it. It's heard widely. There was once, on the coldest day of the year, a little boy who was sent out to the woods by his grandmother with a sled to fill it with wood and bring it back because they needed to have a warm fire that night. Well, he took that sled out into the woods and he broke off the lower branches of, spruce trees or jack pines. He picked up the fallen limbs from the aspen and he piled his sled high. Now, I don't know how he did it, but it has happened to me. He dropped a mitten and didn't seem to notice. In fact, I count it as a personal triumph if I can make it through a winter with a matching pair of mittens. Well, he had his dog with him and he continued on, picking up more firewood. But when he disappeared from the scene, a little mouse came scurrying down the forest trail, and she saw that fur-lined mitten and that feathery, furry ruff on that mitten, and she thought, oh, that looks like the perfect spot for me to spend the winter. And she squeezed inside and, oh, it was perfectly warm. But just as she made herself comfortable, who should come hopping down the forest trail but a frog? Oh my goodness, is there room for me in there? She said. I don't have a nice warm fur coat like you do. Oh, why certainly, said the mouse. Come on in. And they made themselves comfortable. But who should come swooping down from a tall tree but an owl? Well, I'm chilly too, said the owl. Can't I come in and just warm up for a little while? Well, owls made mice nervous. And so the mouse said, well, if you're on your best behavior, you can come in. Well, the owl squeezed in, and the three of them were there, just as comfortable as you can be, when whom came hopping down the forest trail? A snowshoe hare, all white except for the tips of its ears, which are black. Oh, I'd like to get in there too. Is there room for me? Well, it is getting a little tight, said the mouse, but come on, we'll make room for you. And so the snowshoe hare squeezed in, and all was comfy, and some were starting to nod off. It was getting to be so very comfortable when whom should come down the forest trail but a fox. That made the hare a little nervous. Oh, I'm so cold. I can hardly stand it out here. Couldn't you let me inside? Isn't there a little room for me? I promised to be good. And so they allowed the fox to get in, although now the mouse was wondering if maybe she should have invited everybody. Then who came down the forest trail? A big gray wolf. Oh, that made everybody kind of nervous. But the wolf said, I'm so old and my hide's getting so bare and thin and couldn't I please come in for a little while? I'll mind my manners. Well, the fox squeezed in a paw and then another, and somehow he squinched right into that mitten. And all were, well, a little tight, but warm. Then they heard something, well, oh my goodness, it was a wild boar just outside the mitten. Oh, please, he said, I know my bristles are prickly, but please, can't I come in? It's so cold out here. Well, the mother mouse said, I suppose, but please, there isn't much room. And when he stuck his snout in, you could hear the stitches of that mitten start to creak. And somehow he squeezed himself in, and all were tight, but very comfortable. Then who should come down the forest trail? Growling to himself, I'm not used to spending the winters outdoors like this. I usually have a nice warm den to sleep. Could I come in with you guys and warm up? No room, no room, said the mouse. Oh, the bear said, there's always room for one more. And he squeezed in a paw, and the mitten stretched, and he squeezed in another paw, and the mitten stretched and popped a few stitches. But he got his whole self in there, and oh, he was comfortable, and so was everybody else, and everybody was minding their manners. And who should come down that forest trail? Why, it was the boy's dog. And the dog saw that mitten, and he perked up his ear. He saw that mitten. It seemed like it was breathing in and out, in and out. And he put his paw on that mitten, and it rolled down the trail a bit. And then the dog went to pick up the mitten in his mouth, and out popped the bear, the boar, the wolf, the fox, the owl, the hare, the frog, and the mouse. They scrambled off in all directions. Just then the boy came down the forest trail, and there was the dog with the mitten in his mouth. Oh, good boy, you found it. And the boy put his mitten back on and headed home with his sled full of wood for Grandma. But he thought he saw a mouse run off with a little bit of red wool, like the liner to his mitt, on top of her head. That's the story. Well, let's take a look at a pair of mittens from John's family's collection. The pair of mittens looks like that. You can see that there's a sun and boys and girls, or maybe men and women holding hands. These belong to John's aunt, great aunt, Ethel B. Craig, who was an avid traveler, and probably came from one of her travels, but we don't know anything more about them. I do know that in some cultures, though, mittens and their designs have symbolic significance, and that they even have or offer protection to the wearer. Well, let's have another story. This one is another tight squeeze. There's no mitten, but there is a dog who complicates the entire thing. This story comes from 1868 or thereabouts, when Egerton Ryerson Young brought Methodist evangelism to the far north, well, at least to northern Manitoba. He brought the word of the Lord to the camps of Cree and Anishinaabe people. He came by canoe in the summertime. He came by dog train in the wintertime. Now, there's an expression you might not know, dog train. Well, train comes from the French for sled, traîneau, and traîneau à chien. Why, that's a sled drawn by dogs. He always had a couple of guides with him to translate and help him find his way. When they came to a camp, they were welcomed by the people because they brought news from other distant camps, and even the odd goings on of white people back in the East. Native people were interested in that. They listened politely to his sermons and to his prayers. And when he came to this one camp in particular, he was invited to stay the night. Ujibitu said, "Please come into my lodge." Well, when Egerton Ryerson Young ducked his head inside the wigwam of Ujibitus, he saw that it was only maybe, 16 feet at its greatest width. And between he and his two guides and all of the rest of the people who were there that night, there were 23 people who were going to stay the night. Well, Egerton Ryerson Young spoke about the importance of family prayers. This was a concept that was familiar to Anishinaabe people from, of course, their own spiritual context. He recited a few prayers from the Methodist evening prayers, and his guides, of course, attempted to translate for him. Then at last it was time to go to bed. Now, Egerton Ryerson Young thought, how are 23 of us going to fit in here? He thought maybe he and his guides ought to sleep outside where they usually did, but that might give offense to his host. So Ujibitus made the sleeping assignments. The missionary will sleep next to me on my left side. My wife will be on my right. My children will be beyond her. Next to the missionary will be his guides. And then next to my children, a woman, a man, and so on around that circle of 23 sleepers. Egerton Ryerson Young's guides brought in his blankets and laid them out for him and even tucked him in. The missionary said, lying there, it made him think of like wheels on a wagon spoke, and the hub was the fire, for all put their feet to the fire and their head to the birch bark wall. Well, some of them, even though they were lying down, were still smoking their pipes and having a little conversation. And at last the conversation died out and everyone fell asleep. Egerton Ryerson Young was on the very edge of sleep when one of the dogs that had been banished to the outside for the night ducked his nose underneath the door flap, a deerskin stretched between two short poles, and slipped inside, hopped over each one of the sleepers until he found the kettle where the night's fish stew had been. There was nothing left but bones and a good aroma. The dog ducked his head inside and licked it out thoroughly, then hopped around the sleepers again until he came to the missionary and his master, Ujibitus. The dog, wedged in between the missionary and his master, turned around 3 times, flopped to the ground, curled his tail over his nose, and prepared to stay for the night. Well, Edgerton Ryerson Young said to the dog, "Look, I appreciate fine dogs, and you may stay the night, but only if you are quiet and make no motions at all. Agreed? Otherwise, you're out." The dog slept. Edgerton Ryerson Young situated himself in his blankets again and thought calming thoughts. He was just on the edge of falling into a deep sleep when the dog sat up and perked its ear. He had an itch behind his ear, and with his back leg began to work so vigorously at that itch that the part of the dog that corresponds to the elbow on a human was beating a rapid tattoo into the ribs of Edgerton Ryerson Young. Edgerton Ryerson Young cuffed that dog. The dog slunk out. And now he situated himself again and prepared to fall asleep. And maybe he was sleeping. But again, the dog snuck in the door, hopped around the edge, checked the pot for some more soup, hopped over every sleeper, and again nosed his way in between the missionary and his master. Again, Edgerton Ryerson Young woke up, said a bit tightly this time, "Now I'm serious. You can stay if you're quiet. Otherwise, you're out." And again, the dog turned around a few times, flopped to the ground, tucked its nose underneath its tail, and fell asleep. And again, Edgerton Ryerson Young, maybe he tried to count backwards from 100, did all that he could to fall asleep. And when at last he was on the cusp of sleep again, that dog started scratching at his ear. That must have been one heck of an itch. Well, now, I know that you who have a dog sometimes invite him up on your bed, don't you? And you might make little accommodations for your dog, and at first everything is just fine. But ultimately, doesn't that dog, no matter small or large, stretch his legs, all 4 of them, out against your side and arches his back at the same time and pushes and makes himself a little more room? Give a dog an inch and he'll take the entire bed. They have us trained to roll over for them. Well, Edgerton Ryerson Young gave that dog a cuff and sent him flying out of that wigwam. I hate to tell you this, but it happened to him several more times that night. Well, at last, that exhausted and very exasperated Methodist missionary was able to fall into the arms of welcome slumber. And he turned on his left side and fell fast asleep. Well, just about that time, next to him, Ujibitus, did I tell you he was a tall man? Yes, he was a very tall man. And I guess he was having little troubles of his own sleeping and had to stretch his legs and turned over on his side, left side, facing the missionary. And, well, he drew his knees up to his chest. And at the exact same moment that his knees dug into the back of the missionary sat up straight, half asleep. Pow! He punched his host in the ribs. Oh, what are you doing? That man jumped up out of his bed. He shouted some instructions to his people. Babies cried, women screamed, dogs barked, women grabbed their kids and made for the door. Egerton Ryerson Young lay there looking up, wondering if he was looking into the barrel of a gun. His guides next to him said, "What's the matter? What did you do?" Oh, Egerton Ryerson Young attempted to explain. "I thought he was a dog. I thought he was a dog. Tell him I thought he was a dog." Now, these guides of his were also native fellows, and maybe they didn't have 100% grasp of English grammar, and perhaps they made the tiniest mistake with their tense when they reported to Ujibitus, their host, "The missionary thinks you are a dog." What? How could anybody say that to a fine host, no matter where he is, no matter where he lives? "He thinks I am a dog. I extended my hospitality to him. He is supposed to be a man of God." Well, Egerton Ryerson Young scrabbled next to him, the guide, into his bag, a fire bag made from tanned deer hide. Inside a fire bag, you might have your flint and steel and a bit of tinder for starting a fire. Or maybe you'd have your pipe and tobacco, possibly your ammunition. He felt around and found the man's tobacco, and then he reached up and touched the hand of Ujibitus with his tobacco. Ujibitus probably recognized the smell. He took that tobacco and passed it around the circle. Everybody took a little pinch and packed their pipes with it. Then somebody threw some more wood on the fire, and when it blazed up, they lighted their pipes. And when Egerton Ryerson Young deemed that it was safe enough, he cautiously peeled back his blankets and warily stood and tried to tell the story in sign, how he was sleeping. He got down on all fours to show the dog coming in. He even stuck his head in the kettle to show the dog licking out the fish stew. People started to titter when he did that. And then he showed how the dog came around the circle and how he cuffed that dog and went flying out, and how that dog came back. And now the people were starting to chuckle. And then he showed how he punched Ujibitus, thinking that he also was the dog. And now people were laughing, calling out to their head man, maybe politely teasing him, laughing behind their hands. Well, all was well. In fact, Ujibitus and Egerton Ryerson Young became fast friends. Ujibitus guided for Egerton Ryerson Young, but he never would sleep next to him, as it was his right as his guide. For he thought, and was willing to tell you, "I slept next to him once, and I got punched in the ribs. What would happen to me again?" A story from the North, a true life story from Egerton Ryerson Young. So now we'll take a look at one of Egerton Ryerson Young's books, By Canoe and Dog Train. This is his very first book. That story came from his second one. And here is a photo, or a drawing from a photo of him dressed in winter gear. And that square bag there at his side with the long fringes, that is probably a fire bag. And it would have been decorated, as I said, with beads and maybe quill work. So, Egerton Ryerson Young. Some of the perils of winter you just cannot count on. You just don't know what's going to happen. In 1930, Elliot Merrick and his wife, Kay, traveled to, oh, I know what I want to show you before I do that. No, I do want to do this. In 1930, Elliot Merrick and his wife, Kay, traveled to far northern Labrador and spent the winter with a trapper there on his trap line. And he listed some of the hazards of winter travel. The first one, losing a mitten. The second one, falling through bad ice. The third one, losing or not having a match safe. And the fourth one, leaving a poorly silvered spoon in the stew. I think I need to explain both of those. You see, a match safe would be a container that you could keep your matches in. Now, if you left the match safe at home, that'd be bad. But if you didn't have one, those matches, kitchen matches like these, why, they could ignite spontaneously from friction in your pocket. Even John, my partner John's dad, warned him about that in the 80s. What about the spoon? Well, if you eat off of silver plate and you know that sometimes your spoon gets kind of worn, it can kind of make your food taste rather metallic. But in the earlier days, when the flatware was made from pewter and it had a lot of lead in it, more lead than tin, leaving the spoon in the stew could actually poison you and anybody else who ate from the stew. Something like what's happened in Flint, Michigan with their lead-lined water pipes. That's still going on today. Elliot Merrick also cited as a peril of winter travel, leaving your axe flat down in the snow. If you split wood, you know this can happen so easily. You leave it there, wind arises over the night, drifts snow over your axe, or more snow falls, and the next morning, you can't remember where you left it. Now, he said that an axe was an indispensable and most useful tool. It was used as, well, as something you can saw with, of course, as a hammer, as a plane, as an anvil, as a wedge, and 1,000 other things, as he said. But it could be a dangerous friend. For few of us who use axes haven't been bit by that bright-bladed friend. I've got a little scar on my index finger from a splitting maul, but the chopper glove or chopper mitt I was wearing, it was more greatly impacted than my hand. Well, one of the things that Egerton Ryerson Young and his men would do with an axe when they traveled, they might come to a broad river that hadn't frozen, but there would still be sheets of ice attached to the banks of the river along the shore. And what they would do to get across that river would be to cut some long poles, and then they'd climb on that sheet of ice with the dogs and their sleds, and the men would take their axes and chop at the ice until it was freed from the shore. And now with the long poles, they would navigate the current of the river and hopefully arrive at the other side before that ice sheet broke up into smaller pieces. Here's a story about a trapper and his axe from Alexander Henry, who traveled in some of the same country as Egerton Ryerson Young, only 100 years earlier. A trapper was coming home late at night. It wasn't dark yet, but it was getting there. He had 2 beaver that he carried on his back. It must have been mid-November or early December, just after freeze up, and still there wasn't snow on the ground. So he didn't carry a sled with him, didn't haul a sled behind him. And instead of snowshoe on his feet, he had his moccasins. Well, he was trudging along. He was 3 miles from home, but between him and his camp was a frozen lake. Cautiously, he stepped offshore onto that frozen lake. And with his trade axe, which he wore handy at his side, tucked into his sash, he chopped some test holes to see how deep the ice was. 4 inches is the recommended depth for holding a full-grown man walking. And you know that ice varies in thickness from place to place on the same body of water. Even it varies in thickness from morning until night, depending upon the temperature of the day. Minnesota's Department of Natural Resources reminds us, and I'll remind you, ice is never 100% safe. They recommend that you make a test hole every 150 feet. Well, he tested that ice. It seemed deep enough. He tucked that trade axe back into his sash, and cautiously he headed out. The ice was dark, glossy, and smooth, perfect for ice skating, but for walking on moccasins, not so much. If you've ever fallen on the ice or the ground, you know how time seems to speed up, how that ground or that frozen ice comes up to meet you so fast. Bam, you're down, you're hit. Oh, just in case you think this is the story of a man who's going to break through ice. No, it's not. Rather, it's the story of an amputation. The trapper fell hard on his right side. All of his weight came down on his wrist, and his wrist came down on the blade of his axe and severed his hand from his arm. His hand dangled by a strip of thin flesh. Ay, the blood, the shock of it all. The pain. Well, quick, do something. Compress that arm. Slow the flow of that blood. Take a piece of your moccasin lacing or a wrap of your sash or tear off the tail of your shirt. Something, anything. Wrap it around that arm. But what about the hand? Well, I know of the end of a nose being reattached with a bit of balsam gum or spruce gum. And of course, a mangled ear can be mended with needle and thread. And I've even heard of one fairly successful scalp being reattached. But a hand? Not before the era of modern medicine, and not this time either. So take that axe and finish the job it started. The shortest way home was across that frozen lake. As I said, he was 3 miles and it was getting dark. But somehow that man made it home, and Alexander Henry said he was able to cure himself with mere simples. Simples would be the plants that you gather for their medicinal properties, the blossom perhaps, the leaves, the roots, the barks. With dried yarrow, you could stop the bleeding. I'm sure he must have packed that bloody stump into dried sphagnum moss. It has great absorbency properties. And for pain, well, maybe make a strong decoction of the inner bark of aspen. In some way, this man survived. Well, now I'm going to show you a picture, a botanical drawing of what yarrow looks like, so that you can identify it in the wild and use those leaves if you ever need it, raw or dried. Now, its Latin name, its scientific name is Achillea millefolium. Supposedly Achilles used yarrow to stanch his warriors' wounds in the Battle of Troy. And the millefolium, well, you see the finely cut leaves looked to someone, whoever named it, as if there were 1,000 leaves. Sphagnum moss. Well, I learned that sphagnum moss was used extensively in World War I. It was sandwiched between two layers of muslin, sterilized, dried, sent out to the field or into hospitals. It also has antiseptic properties. Now let me show you a photo of a couple of Cree sleds. This trapper, had it been a little later in the year, would have used these sleds. You can see how they're turned up at the ends to enable them to go across the snow easily and to get through the brush. Well, getting a hand amputated, that's not something you might anticipate on one of your winter travels. These stories encode some good advice, though, whether they're stories from folklore or from real life. The next story I'm going to tell is about advice. But first, let me give you a little from my own experience. That trapper, I would, if I was carrying that axe at your side, I'd have that in a sheath. I would. And you know, had he had his mittens on, he probably had them over his neck, but maybe slipped them out when the weather got too warm or he got too worked up, too heated up. He probably slipped those mittens off. Had he had one on, might have been a different ending to that story. Well, one of my favorite and most useful pieces of advice came from Old Lady Dexter, a friend of mine who lived on the Mississippi River, just downriver from the Leech Lake confluence and just upriver from Gambler's Point. She told me that if you have an outside door, like a storm door or a screen door, and it opens outward and there's a big storm coming, well, secure that door, tie it open. Because if you get a lot of snow or it drifts in front of your door, you want to be able to get out when you need to. I've used that advice in this place. My mother, she would say from her own experience, when you're outside playing, no matter what the big kids say, never touch your tongue to frozen metal. Apparently she had done this maybe on the playground at school. I don't know, a pump, a railing, and her tongue stuck and she jerked it away and some skin came loose and it hurt. Yeah. Another piece of advice came from a friend of mine who used to coach kids on their, just before going out on their solo trips in the winter time. Erling Haig, who was one of the designers of the Haig sled, an expedition type pulk sled, would say, well, if you think you're gonna freeze out there, just lie down in the snow with your arms straight at your sides, so that when we come to haul your frozen carcass out, your arms won't get caught in the brush. That's what he told his Thistledew Camp students before they went out the next day on their solo trip. This story comes from the Swami people, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, although they lived from Norway, Sweden, across Finland to the Kola Peninsula of Russia. And like the Cree of the Anishinaabe, they had cultural differences and different dialects. And that's where this story comes from. It's about a mother's advice. There was long, long ago, out on the Taiga, a girl who lived with her mother and father in a sod-covered house. Her mother was wise in the ways of the world and especially of making her living from the land. She knew where the plumpest berries grew, and she knew when the fish were running. It was her mother who would launch the boat, take up the oars and row out and cast out the net, and all of them would haul in the catch together. It was her mother who would say, when the meat was low, "I'm taking my bow and my arrows," and she would lead them out into the woods. But a strange sickness fell upon the land, its heavy hand onto that little hut on the taiga. Both the mother and the father were struck ill. The father would survive, the mother would not. She knew she was dying, and she called her daughter to her side. "Promise me," she said, "you will always take care of the old man, and that you will remember everything that I have taught you." Well, she did die, and the girl continued to make cranberry tea for her father and rub bear fat into his skin and feed him the liver of deer for strength. Soon the word of the wise women's passing spread throughout the taiga. These people had been rich in their time. They had much meat, much fish. They had a lot of fur coats and feather beds. And when the girl got old enough to help her parents, why, they prospered. News of a wealth to be plucked came to an old beggar woman who lived in a distant land with her daughter. She preferred to make her living by begging, never doing anything for herself. She hitched up her rickety old buck deer to her rickety old sledge. That's all she had left in the world. And she made her way across hill and across valley, come to that house where that widower sat outside. She saw that big herd of plump deer and those well-trained dogs. "Widower," she said, "is that your herd?" He nodded. "Well, hear this," she said. "I'm mistress here now." The girl had been out searching for firewood. When she got back towards the house, where she could hear strange voices and someone was banging on a kettle. And when she opened the door, there was her father with dribble down his chin and empty bag of, well, a sealskin bag of what once held firewater there on the table. "Father," she said, "do we have company?" "Company," the woman said. "I'm not company. This is my house now. I am mistress of all." "Father," she said, "is that true?" He was in some sort of state. His head dropped unwillingly. And the beggar woman said, "Now bring us something to eat." The girl brought freshly baked rusks and cloudberry jam, and she plumped up the feather beds for the beggar woman and her daughter to sleep that night. The old beggar woman thought, "How am I going to get rid of this girl?" The next morning she woke early, gave the old man a poke, said, "Hitch up the deer to my sled and hitch up some deer to yours and load all of your belongings upon it." Well, he did as he was told, and onto that sled went hides, fur coats, fur pelts, cooking kettles, the feather beds. Onto that sled went absolutely everything they owned. "And leave the girl here. She can stay here and think about her mother." Then she whistled up the dogs, and the dogs pushed the deer out. And the old man, her father, disappeared over the hillside. Now that girl was left in an empty house with nothing, I mean, nothing. No food, no bedding, nothing. She sobbed. How could this be true? She cried and cried so hard, and when she was done with her crying, as sometimes happen when we have a long cry, she was hungry, but there was nothing to eat and nothing to cook any food with. And then it seemed as if there was a little whistle of wind that came through that house, or maybe it was a whisper of her mother's voice. Daughter, remember what I have taught you. The girl looked around, trying to find the source of that voice. There was a little twist of yarn over there in the corner. Beggar woman had overlooked that. The girl picked up that twist of yarn and wondered, what can I make with this? She went out to the hillside where the red berries were ripe and the partridge were feeding. From that twist of yarn, she made a loop, and from that loop, she made a snare, set it upon the ground, covered it over with leaves, waited patiently until a lame, lone partridge stepped into her trap. She got him, took him home, stripped off his feathers, even stripped the veins from his legs. And from those veins, she made another snare, went back out to the hillside, set 2 more snares, caught 2 more partridge. Well, now she had food, but still no cooking kettle, no way to start a fire. Daughter, remember what I have told you. Out into a glade of silver birch. She peeled some bark from a tree. She twisted it and braided it into the shape of a bowl. And then she got wet mud and coated the outside of that bowl and set it in the sun to bake. But what about a fire? She searched in the ashes of the hearth. She found 2 broken flints that the beggar woman had overlooked. She got some dried moss, made a little nest, covered it over around with birch bark, and with the flints, she struck a spark, caught that spark in that nest, blew on it until it flamed. And now she had the starter for a fire. She got 2 green sticks, set them over the fire, put her birch bark kettle on top, filled it with water, put the partridge inside, and soon she had a good meal simmering on the fire. Partridge broth to drink, meat to eat. Every day she went out to that hillside while the partridge were feeding there and set more snares, and with their leg veins made more snares. And now in the corner of her house, she had a whole pile of feathers and down, and this was a comfy place to sleep at night, except that sometimes the feathers got in her nose and in her mouth. Daughter, remember what I have taught you. Her mother used to weave a tight thread from partridge veins and down. Out into the woods she went, brought back a sturdy stick, not so big, but smooth. Now she had a spindle for spinning her thread. And when she had enough thread wound round that spindle, why, she remembered that her mother wove eider downs, and she tucked the feathers and the down into 2 layers of eider, and now she had a nice quilt and no more feathers up her nose or in her mouth. Things were starting to look up, but still, it was lonely out there all by herself. Again, she remembered what her mother taught her. The next morning she got out, went out into the spruce swamp, pulled up some stripling spruce, braided their roots with yarn, and now she had a stout lariat. The next day, she went looking for a herd of wild deer. 4 days it took her to find that herd. She crept along the edge of where they were browsing. She hid, and when they had forgotten that she was there, she waited for a fawn to stray from its mother's side. And then she jumped up, threw her lariat around that fawn's neck, tugged that fawn home. And by the time they got home 4 days later, that fawn was just trotting right at her side. Now she had company. Sometimes she brought the fawn inside. She collected grass for the fawn and moss and lichen for the winter, brought it water. Oh, things were really looking up, but it was getting late in the year and she needed more meat and she needed better clothes. But what did her mother do? She went out to the place where the willows grew and she found one that was arched over in a perfect bow shape. She brought that willow home and with a bit of her lariat, she strung that bow tight. She found some slender, smooth sticks, dried them above her fire and fitted some sharp bones into those sticks. And now she had a bow and arrow. She went out into the woods. She saw a fox slinking along, hunting mice. She saw squirrels up in the trees, cutting pine cones down for the winter. She let an arrow loose at a squirrel and one at the fox, got them both, brought them home, stripped their pelts, stretched them and dried them. Next day she went out, she gathered lots of pelts. The snow was starting to fall. And one day when she woke up, the mother deer was there beside her fawn. Oh no, now she would lead it away. But that afternoon when she got back with more squirrel hides, the doe was still there. And the next day, more deer appeared. And the next day, more after that. Now the girl with a bird bone needle sewed those squirrel hides, those pelts together and made herself a squirrel skin coat. And with the pelt of the fox, a fox fur hat. She was warm, she had food, she had company, she had a feather bed. But now she had all these deer. How was she going to keep them from scattering come spring when they went on their migration? She knew what she would do. Her mother had told her, "Child, don't forget what I said." She traveled some days to a river. High above that river was a bank strewn with boulders, and dug into that bank was a wolf's den. When the mother wolf was away hunting, the girl scrambled up that bank, reached into that den, took out 4 cubs and brought them home, trained them to be good guard dogs, taught all of them their manners. Meanwhile, a year has gone by, and in the land of the beggar woman, the father has had to be herder, housekeeper, cook, and all. And the beggar woman and her daughter, why, they've gone through every bit of that wealth, sold it all off or traded it. "Hitch up the deers," she said. All they had left was that one buck deer. "We're going back to your country where you were rich in meat and fish." She wondered, she hoped that the wolves would have scattered the bones of the girl by the time they got there. Imagine their astonishment when they pulled up to that sod-covered hut. There was a fine herd of deer guarded by some very respectable-looking dogs. And there was the girl herself, dressed in her fox fur hat and her squirrel coat. "Father, you've come back at last. Come in, rest on my feather beds. Let me get you some partridge broth." Then it seemed as if the fog lifted from that man's head. He looked at his daughter and at the beggar woman and her daughter, and he gave that old rickety buck, a thump on its rump, which sent that sled with the daughter and mother off the way they came. "Begone now, and never come back again," he said. Well, this is how the story ends. The father and the daughter stayed together and never left each other's side. I think you'll agree with me that she learned her mother's advice well. Well, here's a photo from about 1870 of what a Sami sod-covered hut would look like. Well, let's go on to a story from Estonia, from across the Gulf of Finland, from Finland. Another story about an old traveler. And again, it's late at night. Well, that's when it's getting to be troublesome. An old traveler was making his way home, but it was dark, and he knew he needed a place to sleep for the night. The wind had risen and was driving sleet into his face. How cheered he was when he saw on the horizon a little settlement. He walked up to the richest looking house in that settlement and knocked on the window. A cross woman flung those windows open and said, "Who's rapping at my windows? What do you want, you old tramp?" "Oh, good lady," he said, "I've come a long ways and I've got a long ways to go. Couldn't you make a little bit of space for me for the night?" "I most certainly will not," she said. "I'll set the dogs on you." And she slammed those windows closed. Well, fortunately, there was another little house there. It was little and low, and there was a cheerful glow coming from its windows, and the sound of children at play wafting across the snow. He knocked on the door. The woman opened it. Again, he said, "Good lady, I've come a long ways. I've got a long ways yet. Could I spend the night on your floor?" "Well," she said, "it's pretty crowded in here. I've got quite a few kids, but of course, come in. You're welcome." He sat at her table and he looked around at those children playing, and then he said, "Madam, I have a hard question for you. Why are those children dressed in such tattered and torn shirts? They need warm clothes for this time of year, don't they?" "Well, it's this way," she explained. "My husband passed away a long time ago, and all that I weave, I must sell to buy food. It's either shirts for the boys or bread for the table. But come now, we were just going to eat. Come, have something to eat with us." "Oh," he said, "I have just eaten. But here, maybe the children would like this." And from his sack, he drew bread and cheese and apples, and the children fell upon it. The next morning, as he was making his way from that place, she accompanied him to the gate. And he turned and he said to her a curious thing. "Madam, what you do in the morning, you will do until evening." What in the world did he mean by that? But she didn't give it any further thought, because she was still thinking about how her children appeared like ragamuffins, and certainly the rest of the villagers would think the same. But now, isn't there a little bit of linen that I had left? She went next door to the rich lady's house to borrow a measuring stick to see if she had enough to make a shirt or two. And when she brought back the measuring stick, she measured. Oh, she had more than she thought. She measured a second time. Oh, she had more yet. She measured a third time. Oh my goodness, the linen was growing. She measured and measured and measured and measured, and the pile of linen grew and grew until evening there was enough cloth to make her boys' shirts for the rest of their lives. Well, she dashed over to her neighbors, the rich woman that she had borrowed the measuring stick from. "You'll never guess what happened," she said. Why, that rich woman seethed inside. "That could have been me. I could have had my every wish fulfilled." The next day, she sent her servant to harness up the pony cart. "Go after that old man. You know I've always taken care of the poor," she simpered. Well, when the servant caught up with the traveler, he wouldn't get in that cart. But the servant explained, if I come back without you, she will send me off without my wages. Oh, lad. The traveler climbed into the cart. The rich woman was waiting at her gate. Oh, she trilled. I am so glad to see you again. Oh, please come in. Something to drink, something to eat. And he stayed the night. And he stayed the next day. And he stayed the next day. And he stayed the next day. And the woman was seething again inside. When will this old fool leave? When will I get my wishes fulfilled? She was cheered to see that on the morning of the fourth day, he was packing his sack. She accompanied him to the gate. He was silent. He said nothing. She accompanied him to the gate. She stood there with the gate closed, and she said, what shall I do today? And he looked at her long and hard with steel in his eyes, and he said, that which you do in the morning, you will do until evening. Oh, goody! She raced into her house, scrambled up the stairs, flung open the door of her linen closet. From the topmost shelf, she pulled down sheets and blankets, because underneath that was her jar of money. She was gonna count that money all day, but the dust on that top shelf caused a tickle in her nose, and achoo, she sneezed 3 times. Well, when she sneezed, it raised some more dust. She sneezed 3 more times. She sat down on the floor, intending to count her jar, but achoo, achoo, achoo. Why, the chickens in the coop flew up off their nests and ran out into the courtyard. Achoo, achoo, achoo. The cows and the horses broke out of their stalls and ran over the hillside. Achoo, achoo, achoo. And now her servants ran from the house, their hands clapped over their ears, and still she sneezed. Achoo, achoo, achoo. The windows cracked, the casements shattered, and still she sneezed. On she sneezed throughout the day. The dust rose, the dust settled, and on she sneezed until dark. There she sat, alone, on the floor of the hall in her house. Her jar of money in front of her, but her house fallen in ruins about her. Oh, I thought I had to sneeze there. I guess I didn't. Well, a story from Estonia, and here's a wintry look at a place in Estonia. This is an open air museum, an old farm. You can imagine the old man traveled through here. Well, these are the tales that bring us closer. The tales when we see winter scenes from across the world, we think, oh, well, those people have experienced what I have. We're not complete strangers. These are the tales that make us, well, feel a little closer to everyone else. I'm going to end with a poem. I'm going to read it. It's a 1-sentence prose poem about a 4-year-old. And since this is the gift season, and what perfect gift for a Northerner, a sweater? This is Minnesota poet Keith Gunderson's poem, Sweaters That Go On Over Your Head. When I was 4, I got a sweater for Christmas that was blue and itchy, and one of those sweaters that go on over your head. And I'd never liked sweaters like that because your head gets punched through the head hole and you're in a dark place for a little too long. So you start to think it'll never be light again. And this new sweater, which was my Aunt Molly's fault, was the worst one of all because it had an extra small head hole like it was made for a grapefruit-sized head. So after my dad stuffed my arms through the sleeves and lifted the dark inside part of the sweater over my head and everything went black, he began to smash my head through the head hole. But I could tell by the the feeling on the top of my head that I'd never make it, so I started to back out. But even my own mom tried to block my escape, and my sister Janice yelled about how she could help hold me, but they wouldn't let her. And then someone jerked the sweater back down hard over my head until my head went through the head hole to just above my eyes where it stuck. So I jumped and ran blind and screaming around the living room and tripped over my sister's new doll and fell down yelling and crying. And my sister was shouting about her dumb doll that tripped me. So my dad and mom finally joined my side and attacked the sweater and freed me from it and told my Aunt Molly, who'd been waiting to see it on me, that I'd try it on later and it sure would look cute. But I wouldn't even put a dangerous sweater like that in my present pile and stuck it over by Janice's doll. And my aunt said to my dad, whose other name was Laverne, "Laverne, you should have just yanked it over his head and he'd gotten used to it." And I heard her say that and didn't want her to babysit with me anymore. And during the next few years, there came to be a special drawer in my dresser set aside for those sweaters I got for Christmas and birthdays that were supposed to go on over my head, but never did. And I wondered how they liked being stuck in a dark place with no way out. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I have always enjoyed that poem by Keith Gunderson. Well, it must be getting to be bedtime for some. I know I could a bowl of popcorn or maybe a cup of hot chocolate. So how are we going to make it through this winter? Well, one thing that you can do is read a lot of books, look at art, make art, do craft, and get outside and see the day or see the night. You don't need any fancy equipment. You don't need sleds or snowboards or skis or anything. Just like this boy here and his dad. You just play outside.
Will you help me, please?
Well, what do you need me to do?
Like, dig more with me?
Yeah, I can help you. Get in there.
Send it to Grandma Terry. She will love this video.
Yeah, she will.
And I do. My grandson Spencer and my son Nathan. Well, it's been a lovely evening. It was so great to pass this winter's night with you with some stories. And lastly, I guess I would say, tell more stories. Thanks for being with us.
Terry, thank you so much. This was a really delightful way to wrap up our Crafting in Place series here in 2020. Given that the pandemic continues, Crafting in Place, which are free online digital programs for anybody who's interested in participating, will continue on in 2021. We will be hosting a film festival in January, and it's going to be really easy. We're going to post some links to incredible, cool craft films, about 3 a week, on our website. You'll get them in our e-news. And so for each week of January, we'll send you some real gems that you might not have found on the internet on your own. Everything from sign painters to tattoo artists, all kinds of documentary films about people doing craft, which is really, for us at North House, a great way to carry ourselves through this. So again, thanks to Terry, thanks to everybody who joined us this evening, and all of us at North House wish you all a very warm and cozy holiday season, and look forward to seeing you on Zoom and hopefully on campus in 2021. Thanks, everybody.